Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. This is Salim Akhtar Malik, your host at the Observation Post channel. On this channel, I talk to you about national and international affairs, issues pertaining to defense and security matters, military technology, as well as important events from military history. You can interact with me on this channel by giving your views and comments, which help me in fine-tuning my talks, which I deliver to you from time to time on this channel. So I'll be grateful to you if you give me your comments and views on this talk also. You can connect with me on Twitter also, where my address is at Salim Akhtar 53. In this session, I'll be talking to you about the recent developments in the Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, where an all parties conference was called by the Modi government to discuss, ostensibly or presumably, the future of the Kashmir state. So, this conference was held. It was called by Prime Minister Modi, in which he had invited the pro India political parties of the Indian held Kashmir. There was no agenda which was given, and it was a vague sort of preliminary agenda which said that the situation in the Indian held Kashmir in the wake of the 5th of August 2019 action by the Indian government would be discussed. And beyond that, everything was murky. So, what happened on 5th of August 2019 was when India abrogated Article 370 and 35A of its constitution, which, though cosmetically, had provided a semblance of autonomy to the people of Jammu and Kashmir, that is the Indian held Jammu and Kashmir, and also prevented the non-Kashmiris, that is the people living in other states of India, from getting domiciles of the Jammu and Kashmir state, that is the held state, as well as from buying property there. So this was a sort of arrangement which was made during the 1950s as a result of the negotiations between Nehru and Sheikh Abdullah. As a quid pro quo for Sheikh Abdullah's help and assistance to India in getting the Indian held Kashmir becoming part of India, though it was a disputed state. So, as a result of the 5th August 2019 action by the Indian government, the state of the occupied state of Jammu and Kashmir was trifurcated into 3 union territories. Now, a union territories is one which is directly administered and ruled from the center, that is from New Delhi. And these union territories were Jammu, which is a Hindu dominated region, the Kashmir Valley, which is a Muslim dominated region, and the Ladakh region, where though the population is sparse, it is divided almost equally between the Buddhists and the Muslims. So there are almost 50% Buddhists and an equal number of Muslims, and then 1 or 2% Hindus and followers of other religions. So this they had done, and the trifurcation was followed by clamping down a curfew and a lockdown of the state, the longest in the history of the world, or longest clampdown, a curfew, or lockdown that has taken place anywhere else in the world. The civic amenities and facilities were suspended, including the internet facilities, and these actions were taken in order to isolate the Kashmiris from the rest of the world. And this continued for almost 2 years. And after that, there is this conference or a meeting which was held by which was called by the Indian government under Modi to discuss the latest situation in Kashmir and take measures accordingly. So this has taken place almost 2 years after the abrogation of Article 370 and 35A. So one can ask, have the objectives which were before the Indian government at the time of abrogation of Article 370 and 35A, have those objectives been achieved? So this is something very controversial, whether they have achieved their objectives or not, and why, if they have, or even they have achieved a semblance of, or a portion of the objectives, why this move now of calling the conference? So the people in Azad Jammu and Kashmir, as well as those in the Indian held Kashmir, are now, some segments are airing their fears that the Indian action would result in ultimately preventing the Kashmiris from ever uniting for a common cause to liberate their country or to liberate their state from the Indian occupation. How true is it? Now, the aims of the Indian government, precisely of Prime Minister Modi, were three. At the time of trifurcation of the state, he had three aims in his mind. The first aim was to change the demography of the state. Second one was to fragment the state physically, that is, to divide it on ethnic lines. And third was to prevent the state to prevent the Kashmiris from uniting in a common cause to launch a liberation movement for the achievement of their ultimate objective, that is independence from the yoke of Indian occupation. So none of these three objectives have been achieved. It is not easy to change the demography of Jammu and Kashmir, that is the Indian held Jammu and Kashmir. There are more than 1 crore people living in both Azad Jammu and Kashmir as well as in occupied Kashmir, out of which the majority are Muslims. It is a state, the Indian held Kashmir has an area which is larger than the Pakistani Punjab or Indian Punjab. For the last half a century, Israelis are trying to change the demography of the west bank of River Jordan, which has a population of almost 3 million and which has an area of 2,500 square kilometers. That is an area which is equal to Pakistan's Punjab province, to be precise, the Chakwal district of the Punjab province of Pakistan. But it has not been able, the Israelis have not been able to change the demography of West Bank. So how could Modi change the demography of Jammu and Kashmir state, that is the Indian illegally held Jammu and Kashmir state, which is 10 times larger, even more larger than the west bank of River Jordan, and which is a population which is, as I said, almost 1 crore. So, what India has in mind now by calling this conference, it wants to redraw the constituencies in the Kashmir Valley as well as in Jammu, thereby giving more seats to the Hindu dominated Jammu region and creating an artificial majority of Hindus in the Jammu and Kashmir Legislative Assembly. Once they get a Hindu majority, an artificial Hindu majority in the Legislative Assembly, the next step would be to bring in or get elected a Hindu chief minister. That is, for the first time in history, a Hindu chief minister of Jammu and Kashmir state. Thereafter, they would restore the status of the Jammu and Kashmir state and would contrive to have the Legislative Assembly request the Indian Parliament to abrogate Article 370 because it is a constitutional requirement. The action by Modi in August 2019 does not fulfill this requirement. It has to be the Jammu and Kashmir Legislative Assembly which should request the Indian Parliament to abrogate this Article 370, and that would be then the final step towards the integration of Indian illegally occupied Kashmir into Jammu and Kashmir, into the Indian Union. So this is what they want, but will this happen? If they change the constituencies, they change the redraw the constituencies, will they be able to, even if thereafter they get the Legislative Assembly of Jammu and Kashmir pass a resolution requesting the Indian Parliament to pass a resolution to do away with Article 370 or abrogate Article 370, would it work? It will not work because in 1954, the puppet assembly, that is the puppet legislative assembly of Jammu and Kashmir, had passed a similar resolution which called for the accession of the Indian held Kashmir with the Indian Union. But did it stop the freedom movement and Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir? It did not. And then, if even if they change the demography by redrawing the constituencies, it will not be changing of demography, but sort of a China cutting, a term which is used in Pakistan, where the the properties, that is the public properties, are sliced and thereafter converted into private and commercial properties and then sold off at huge profits. So this sort of arrangement, that is China cutting, will not happen. What would happen is that Jammu region would have greater population. But then during the last 3 decades, most of the militant operations, that is the operations which the militants Kashmir or the Kashmiri freedom fighters had been carrying out against the Indian occupation forces, those actions or those operations were carried out in the Kathua district of the Jammu division, which is a Hindu dominated division. And most of the other acts of militancy had taken place in South Kashmir, which is adjacent to the Hindu dominated region of Jammu. So these redrawing of constituencies will not work. So can there be war as a result of the impasse or the stalemate created by Modi's action? Well, if India had its way, I had been talking in the earlier talks also, if India had its way, it would launch a military operation or a war to capture Azad Jammu and Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan, but it lacks the conventional punch to do so. Failing which, it has resorted to indirect measures by fomenting trouble in Azad Jammu and Kashmir as well as in the Gilgit-Baltistan region, but these acts of insurgency are little more than pinpricks for the Pakistan army because they do not have the popular support. They do not have the popular support required or needed to launch a popular agitation or insurgency in these areas. What the Pakistan army is doing is correct. It is letting the Kashmiri freedom fighters fight the Indian forces, whereas the Pakistan army is maintaining a strategic defensive balance along the line of control. So, in the future, a time will come when there will be a requirement for the Pakistan army to launch an operation across the line of control, but that time has not come. It has not yet come. However, that is also disputed if a war between India and Pakistan, a future war between India and Pakistan, unlike the wars in 1965 and 71, would help in solving the Kashmir dispute. So, what is the way forward? Some 2 decades back, there was an agreement between the Indian and Pakistani governments to open the borders, that is, make the borders along the line of control porous and let the Kashmiris travel across the borders, let them have the freedom of movement. And then there were certain points opened for carrying out trade between the two regions, that is, the portion of Kashmir controlled by Pakistan and that controlled by India. And it was expected that with the passage of time, the border between India and Pakistan along the line of control would become irrelevant, and this will help in reducing the or eliminating the militancy in the occupied Jammu and Kashmir. But this has been put under the rug due to political reasons. There is a need to resurrect the understanding which was reached almost 2 decades ago. This is all what I wanted to say in this session. See you in the next session with a new topic. Till then, bye bye.